Welcome back, everybody. Our next presentation is by Stewart Finlayson. Finlayson is Director of the Gibraltar National Museum Natural History Department and has just completed his PhD at Anglia Ruskin University, Cambridge. Stewart's PhD is in the life sciences, evolutionary biology, specifically looking at the relationship between Neanderthals and birds. Stewart is also working on birds as climate indicators, trying to establish what habitats look like based on the bird species found in the fossil record across Europe. Stewart has pre-recorded this, and we're going to see that now. Any questions will be fielded to Clive Finlayson after the talk. Okay, thank you.
So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this year's Calpe conference. This is a COVID-friendly Calpe conference. We're streaming on YouTube this year, so I hope you enjoy the setup, the way we've been able to produce this conference. It falls on me to talk to you this year about the avifauna of Pleistocene Gibraltar. It's a subject that's quite dear to me. My PhD thesis was on that subject itself. So for those of you who are not familiar with Gibraltar, where we are and what the area looks like, I thought I'd put this image for you. That is the Rock of Gibraltar. That's where we are right now. That there is the rest of mainland Europe. That is Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. And believe it or not, that mountain opposite us is Africa. That's Jebel Moussa in Morocco. And you're going to hear Gorham's and Vanguard caves a lot during this talk. It's because they are part of a complex of caves, the Gorham's cave complex. It's a series of caves at the bottom of the highest part of the rock. They're important to this story because we're talking about these Pleistocene birds, and these remains have been found mainly within these two caves, although there are some other caves such as Devil's Tower, Rock Shelter, and Ibex Cave that have contributed to the information that we have. Now, these are rather large caves. They're about 50 meters or so tall. And I think it's safe to say that they've become rather famous because of the Neanderthals. Now, I'm not saying that these Neanderthals you see on the screen in front of you are from Gorham's Cave. In fact, they're not. That is Nana and Flint, as they have become known. They are reconstructions by Kennis and Kennis of the 1848 Gibraltar 1 skull and the 1926 Gibraltar 2 child skull. They were found in other caves in Gibraltar, Forbes Quarry and Devil's Tower, but the wealth of information and the amount of work that has gone into looking at what these people were doing in Gibraltar and Gibraltar's caves, a lot of that work has happened in Gorham's and more recently in Vanguard caves, and a lot of information is coming from there. As I said before, very large caves, and originally they were never called Gorham's Cave and Vanguard Cave. They were actually part of a complex of caves in the 1800s and even earlier called the Monkey's Caves. It was referred to as the Monkey's Caves and also as the Mediterranean Caves. But it wasn't until much later on, in 1907, when a Captain Gorham decided to explore these caves. Now, access at the time was far more complicated. You either had to access by boat or abseil down that cliff. So the first proper exploration was then. And most people don't realize, but the actual Gorham's Cave is quite a tight little squeeze at the back of what we now know as Gorham's Cave. This little squeeze, you go on your back, if you're that way inclined to want to go into this little crevice, and this is what Gorham's discovered. This passage at the back of Gorham's Cave actually goes in around 37 meters from the main cave. And yeah, it's a rather tight squeeze to get in there. But a lot of the Neanderthal material that we'll be talking about during this talk doesn't come from that section of the cave. It comes from the outer part of the cave. And the first excavations there were pretty much in between 1948 and 1954. It was when the then governor of Gibraltar, went down to the site. He wanted to see these caves, and he felt that they could have been quite important. He obviously noticed something, and he'd heard obviously the story about Dorothy Garrod. Dorothy Garrod was the first female professor in Cambridge University, and she had done the excavation works and discovered the Gibraltar II skull, the 1926 Gibraltar child. And he gave instructions for Dorothy Garrod to be contacted and to ask if she could do some work and excavate in Gorham's Cave. She actually wasn't able to. She was working in another site at the time, but she recommended a colleague from the time, John Vector. Now, he did the excavations you can see in that image on the left-hand side of your screen. And, well, I guess in hindsight, some of us would think that he wasn't very careful in the way that he excavated at the time. And a lot of material was probably lost. And by material, I mean the small detail, the small bird bones, reptile bones, and so on. I guess you could almost say that he was probably looking for the next Neanderthal skull, which he didn't find. He didn't find in Gorham's Cave at the time. But part of that story falls on a lady called Anne Eastham. And she was John Vector's specialist, who was the first person to start looking at bird bones and the remains that were coming from these excavations at the time. Then there was a gap, and the next set of excavations really kicked off in 1989. And that was when a team from the Natural History Museum in London approached people here in Gibraltar, and well, we gathered a team and started these excavations back in 1989. And I'm sure you'll recognize some faces, some of you will, in these images. But again, it was trying to understand what Vector had done, what these previous excavations had done, try to understand the stratigraphy a little, and work through those massive spoil heaps which had been left at the entrance of the cave. Okay, so 1989. We've been working in these caves since 1989, and on the left, as you can see, it's the excavation in Gorham's Cave a few years ago when we had a scaffold to be able to get materials to the upper layers. But let's not forget, it's not all about Gorham's Cave. We've also got Vanguard Cave, as you can see on the right-hand side, and it's a wonderful cave. It really gives us all a really good feeling, in the sense that it was only up until 1989 and early 90s that the first small excavations, test pits, you could almost say, were opened in Vanguard, and the proper excavations only started there in the last 5 years. The beauty of that is that previous to that, no one had excavated, no one had touched this cave, and what we found there were 17 vertical meters of pure untouched deposit, and we've been able to use the latest technology and the latest techniques, archaeological techniques, to start the excavations in that cave. And we're very conscious, we're very careful how we excavate there. So for example, in every level that we reach, half is actually left untouched for future generations, in case there's a new technology, a new way of doing things, so that future generations have untouched levels that they can work on. Now, the sediments in Gorham's are composed of various different things. The main thing that you notice in Gorham's, and especially in Vanguard, is that it's very sandy, and there's Vanguard especially has a huge sand input, and this is from dunes that were on the coastal shelf. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Basically pushed in through wind action. But there are other things that come into the mix, especially in Gorham's, for example. You've got guano from bats that have lived there over millennia. And as you can imagine, a large cluster of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 bats will have an impact on what the sediment below looks like. And then the remains, not of Neanderthals, but of the Neanderthal activity. Activity being, you can have charcoal that's left over after a campfire that they've set up, after butchering an animal and eating it and so on. And it's not always large mammals, shells as well, and so on. Carnivore activity, it doesn't always have to be that humans have brought animals in. Things like hyenas will have brought in whatever animal they are feeding on, so you will find the remains of bones with gnaw marks and so on, coprolites too. And obviously you're in a cave, so chemicals that have percolated through the limestone. Gibraltar is completely made up of limestone, and that will add to the type of deposit we have in that cave. So the chronological framework. The deposits in Gorham and Vanguard cover the period from about 127 to 10,000 years ago. For most of that time, the caves were purely occupied by Neanderthals. Now, when I say 127,000 years ago, I don't mean that the first Neanderthals to use the cave were 127,000 years ago. They were almost definitely there before that. The point is that at 127,000 years ago, the sea level was so high that the cave deposits were actually washed out. So any evidence pre-127,000 years ago was lost at that time. So the evidence that we have is 127 to 10,000 years ago within Gorham's and Vanguard caves. Okay, so Pleistocene climate change. We're going to be talking about glacials and interglacials. Glacials being colder times when there was more water retained in the ice caps further north, and therefore the sea level was lower. And interglacials, well, when it was conditions similar to today, possibly warmer at some points, but very similar to what it is now. And you can see that the sea level on the right-hand image is pretty much what it is today. Now, you may notice that the birds flying around in both images are the same species. They're crag martins. And there's a little bit to talk about them, but we'll do that a little bit later. Gorham's Cave, just so you know which one is Gorham's. That is Vanguard Cave. And that up there is the peak of the Rock of Gibraltar at 426 meters, O'Hara's Battery. These Neanderthal people were hunting mammals and birds, and as we explained before, they were taking them from around the rock itself and into the caves. The remains have been preserved until today, many in really spectacular condition. And this information that we are digging up, this information on the remains that from the animals that Neanderthals were bringing into these caves have allowed us to reconstruct their world in really extremely fine detail. Okay, so to understand the story of the rock and what's happened over these thousands of years, we have to understand that Gibraltar's sea levels have changed drastically year to year. And at different stages, Gibraltar had a coastal shelf which has fluctuated in and out. Now, as you can see in this image, between 80 and 120,000 years ago, that was basically where the coastal shelf would have been. This was between 60 and 80,000 years ago, and at this point you can actually see marked in by circles freshwater springs and lakes. Now, Gibraltar doesn't have a water source, a natural water source. There are no rivers or lakes on Gibraltar as it is today. But between 60 and 80,000 years ago, it's very important to note where these lakes and water sources were, because it was incredibly important, not just for the Neanderthals that were bringing the material, all these animals into the caves, but for the animals themselves. The birds and mammals needed a water source. There's nothing really more important than fresh water for any living being. So it's very important to note that those were there, sandstone pinnacles as well. And between 40 and 60,000 years ago, you can see we're really getting a really big coastal shelf now. And the biggest coastal shelf we've had, that was between 32 and 40,000 years ago. Now, why is this so important? Well, for this reason. As this image depicts, when you have this massive coastal shelf off what is now where the cave is, where the current shoreline is, that is where all the animals that these people were hunting, were living. And we go from really quite amazing animals that nowadays we consider to be African animals, you know, things like the hyena, the leopard. But, you know, they're not really African species. They were once upon a time European species just as much. It's just that we've hunted them off all around Europe, and we've only allowed them to remain in places like Africa. Wolf, animals that you still find in very low numbers in the area, but really some amazing other species like the golden eagle, the bearded vulture, and the great aurochs. And as you can see, when the coastline is similar to what it is today, you still have species that you don't find in Gibraltar at the moment, but some interesting species nonetheless, things like the monk seal, tuna, limpets, the ibex, the bearded vulture, again, and golden eagle, and so on. So what it seems, what a lot of people have been looking at and working at is that in this area, even when the temperatures in the north were really quite extreme, what we had was a climatic refugium, if you like, and this has been modeled. And what you can see here is basically the outline of where this refugium was. In the yellowish orange color, you can see the semi-arid areas, the dry areas and so on, and that was basically the coastal shelf, which would have been a lot of dunes and so on. As I said before, this is where a lot of the animals were living at the time. The beauty of this climatic refugium is that it was retaining humidity even in very arid events. Arid areas were obviously then benefiting from runoff from rivers, and the exposed coastal shelf when the temperature dropped. The entire area was retaining very mild temperatures, so we're talking about very small temperature changes, and these people were not really having to adapt to the extreme conditions that you found. You don't have to go further north than Madrid, really, nowadays, or France, for that matter. And thanks to all this information, with many colleagues, many specialists that have been looking at very different things, we've been able to build a picture such as this one. This was a beautiful representation of what Gibraltar would have looked like, created by Mauricio Anton. We commissioned him to do this work for us, and I really think it shows exactly what we're trying to show about this coastal area off where Gorham's was, with the big sand dunes in the background, you know, piling up against the rock. A lot of vegetation, and this is actually quite accurate. We know very clearly what kind of vegetation was in the area. A lake, species like the azure-winged magpie, which we'll talk about later. And, you know, even down to the great golden eagle landing at a carcass, you know, and the griffon vultures looking on to this animal, the aurochs, and so on. So back to the caves. This is a plan view of the caves. In recent times, we've been able to really use some of the latest technology, and especially with scanning techniques and so on. We've been able to scan these caves to extremely high detail. You can see the size of these two caves, Gorham's and Vanguard. Gorham's shoots off into the back, various meters back, and some of the occupational levels where these Neanderthals were living are at the very back. Vanguard, you can see she's got a huge entrance, and at the back it's all completely dune all the way up with deposit. It asks, the question is the cave blocked with this deposit, or will it open up the more we excavate? We shall see. But this image at the moment gives you an idea of the kind of deposit and the kind of work that happens there. It's meticulous work, section by section, square by square. And obviously, as you can see there, we leave deposits for the future. The beauty of this, of the work that we're doing is, as you can see, and for those of you that are archaeologists, you can see the lines that were painted many, many years ago at the back on the walls of the cave, and that's from you know, laying out your grid using pieces of string and plumb lines and so on. Nowadays, obviously, we don't use that. We use total stations. And we've even gone as far as using some of the latest scanning techniques, whereby we scan every level before it is excavated, so that, I mean, archaeology is destructive. The moment you excavate a level, that level will never be there again. You try to gather as much information as you can, the remains and so on. You can even keep the soil, but you'll never see that level exactly as it was. So we try to go as far as scanning it. So if in the future we need to look at something that we found, or something in hindsight a few years later, we have a highly accurate visual of what that particular level looked like. And as I was saying before about Vanguard, this is Vanguard Cave, and you can see the sand, how it goes up all the way quite steeply to the back of the cave. And you can almost imagine, you know, the flowing dune kind of thing, and how this sand has just been forced into the back of the cave and plugged it up. This is the back of Vanguard. You can see what I mean about the plugging. As I was saying, it does beg the question, does the cave carry on at the back, like Gorham's does? I like to believe that it might, but it'll take us a few years still to be able to work back there and see if the cave does open. But again, you know, technology does play a big part, and it's not like it was many years ago. We now have computers, laptops, tablets for recording the information that's coming out, all on site, because we're able to place generators to create electricity all the way down at the beach, and trail it up with cables. And this is just to give you an idea of the kind of stratigraphy in Vanguard. I mean, very, very sandy, as you can see here. Very, very soft deposits. And to us, it's almost like a little bit of time travel. The lower you go in each of these levels, the older the material, the more recent stuff is at the very, very top. Now, this is an example that I thought I'd put in from 2015, 2016, and it's an occupational level by Neanderthals. And you can see there the charcoal which has been circled out, and basically it was levels, you know, some Neanderthals arrived with their, in this case, I believe it was an Ibex. They cooked their Ibex, hence the charcoal, and there's even stone pine bracts that are around, and it's almost a day in the life of these people. They arrived, they had their meal, left their remains, and carried on. Sand covered the level, and next thing you know it, we're excavating it thousands of years later. That's not the only kind of work that we carry out in these caves. I mean, there's a lot of hard work that carries on back in the laboratories at the Gibraltar Museum, and people don't seem to find this as exciting, but believe me, it's extremely exciting. We've even had a Neanderthal child tooth that came out in the laboratory and was identified there only a couple of years ago. So part of the process. So yeah, it's not all about the stone tools. This is not a talk about Neanderthals specifically, but you know, I had to throw in a slide about some stone tools. And we're talking about the avifauna, but I thought I'd at least mention the large mammals. You know, we have a lot of different animals, remains that are being found in these caves, you know, things like deer, wolf, and so on. And tiny, tiny remains. These are the things that were being missed in the early excavations in the 50s by Vector, for example. Tiny, tiny reptile and amphibian and small mammal bones. And this is meticulously collected and studied back in the laboratory, and experts take a lot of time, you know, looking at these remains through microscopes, identifying them, and you know, down to species level. And this is extremely valuable information for us. Okay, so avifauna, birds. This is the slide that I wanted to explain in a little bit more detail. We've got a huge amount of remains of birds within Gorham's and Vanguard. In fact, we have 161 species of bird identified in the remains within Gorham's and Vanguard. That is a huge amount of species. I believe it's a quarter of the avifauna of Europe. in terms of species. So you've got everything, you know, from vultures, Egyptian vultures, kestrels, golden eagles, and so on. And it's wonderful when you're out in the field, you're a biologist like myself, and you're in the fields, you're looking at a species like this, the gannet, and you're excavating, and you find the skull of a gannet, you know, and it fits in so perfectly, and you're literally looking at this animal, the remains of this animal from, you know, 30, 40,000 years ago. So, back in the laboratory, specialists look at the material that is excavated, and it takes a long time, but under electron microscope, these bones really can show us some secrets. And it was years ago that some taphonomists started looking at the remains in Gorham's and Vanguard and found that there were cut marks and burn marks and different kinds of marks on these bones. A lot on bird bones, but obviously on mammal bones as well. So you can see a monk seal bone there with cut marks from a stone tool. This was then published, where we were able to show that these Neanderthals were catching certain species, in this example pigeons, to eat. You can see that from the bone marks, from the way that they've been cut, which bone specifically, which part of the body, and so on. But it's not only for eating. I mean, some taphonomic work that happened since then with material from Gorham's and Vanguard Cave has shown that Neanderthals were also catching birds for other reasons. It didn't always have to be for eating, and they were catching, in this instance, birds of prey and corvids. So these talons, these wonderful talons that were published from Krapina in Croatia, and yeah, different examples from Crimea and Gorham's Cave itself. We're finding basically that Neanderthals were not just taking birds to eat, but in some instances to use their feathers. It could have been like the center image where they were using it to dress themselves up, adornment, capes. There's various ideas that have come from it, but it's not just for feathers, but also other parts of the remains were being used, such as beaks and talons. So the question is, how can we go in one cave from species such as this? This is the snowy owl. I had to go, well, to pretty extreme lengths to get this image. These species now only live in Arctic and polar conditions, but we find it in the fossil remains here in Gibraltar, in Gorham's Cave. How can we go from species like that to species like that in the same cave? This is a great bustard. This is a plains species. It lives in Spain, and it's from, well, let's say relatively warmer habitats than the snowy owl. So I think we have to understand that the terrestrial cold fauna never got this far. As you can see from this image here, the entire of the north at certain points was completely covered in ice. Some species here highlighted are the mammoth and reindeer. They never reached this far down. Okay, the cold temperatures were really quite low. As from Madrid up, France, Germany were really quite cold areas. But down here, as I mentioned before, we had this climatic refugium where the temperatures were not that different. What does that mean? That a lot of the species that are now able to use all the way, habitats all the way up to Finland, northern Norway, all the way up to 70 degrees north. Even the UK, as you can see from this image, was at times covered in ice. They were all compressed down. So temperate forest species were pushed down, boreal forest species pushed down, because the boreal forests were not in the north like they are now, in Norway, Finland, and so on. The Arctic steppe and tundra species, again, much further down. So what I'm trying to get at is Arctic coastal species, You know, and even the extinct species, such as this reconstruction of a great auk that we have at the Gibraltar Museum, they were also down here. And basically, if you can imagine that the UK was completely covered in ice, you know, Finland, Norway, all of these areas covered in ice, absolutely inhospitable. All of the avifauna that we now have from 70 degrees north all the way to our latitude here in Gibraltar was squashed down. All of these species were compressed into a smaller area. And I think this shows it quite well. The tundra, you can see there in a sort of pinky color, was actually, you know, in France and Germany, in those areas, as opposed to much further north. And I think this again shows it quite well. That's where the ice sheets were at the last glacial maximum at 26,500 years ago. The ice sheets, you can see from the map, were over the UK. Okay? The polar waters were, you know, northern Spain and France, and the polar front was by Oporto in Portugal. I mean, it gives you an idea. I mean, you can almost have visions of being sitting in Oporto in Portugal and seeing an iceberg floating by. But it gives you an idea of just how compressed everything was. The subarctic waters were down here in where we are now. And again, I think I wanted to highlight it in this way, where the white line is. That's basically the inhospitable areas. There's no point where that people would be there for large amounts of time, because it was, you know, it's impossible for them to be living there with just ice. There were no birds, nothing to catch, and so on. Even places where we know that there were Neanderthals, such as France, you know, Germany, and so on. But it was an extreme area, much colder, and so on. This is where it is today, just to give you an example. This is the polar front. Okay. So, going from conditions like this, let's try to break down the bird species into groups. And I'm going to take you through a list of species, and I'm going to try to highlight where these species were living and at what points. So, since we're in the Rock of Gibraltar, I thought we'd start with the rock. And as you can see from the red outline, the image, the map, shows the coastal shelf included, but I'm trying to highlight what is the rock now. And we're talking about cliffs, slopes, and caves. And you had, as we explained before, species like the rock dove. They were living there on the cliffs. They are the ancestor of the domestic pigeon, you know, the annoying pigeon that you find in streets everywhere. But they're one of the commonest birds in Gorham's cave, and they were obviously being eaten. They were used as a food source by these Neanderthals. Other species that we all relate to cliffs, at least in the Iberian Peninsula, things like the red-billed chough, the alpine chough as well, which, you know, they're a stone throw away, as they say, in the Atlas Mountains in Morocco to this day. And other species such as the alpine accenta. All of these remains have been found in Gorham's and Vanguard cave. The raven and the griffon vulture would have nested on the cliffs until probably quite recently. In these timescales that we're talking about now, they would have obviously played an important role in scavenging the large mammals that would have, you know, died or whatever in the area and on that coastal shelf. To this day, we still have the peregrine falcon nesting on the cliff, literally a few meters above Gorham's cave and in the area to this day. But we also have the remains going back thousands of years, as we have the Egyptian vulture remains in the cave. They were actually nesting in Gibraltar up until the Second World War. It was probably all the explosions and tunneling that disturbed these animals, and they left at that point. Bonelli's eagle, another species that disappeared pretty much around World War II from Gibraltar, but again we find that in the fossil record, and these people were bringing in these species into the cave. The mighty golden eagle, I mean, the most powerful of eagles, there was obviously something happening with golden eagles and white-tailed eagles with these Neanderthals. We have various remains from the cave, and they have obviously been living in Gibraltar, making use of those cliffs for many thousands of years. I can only imagine the habitats as it would have been when the coastal shelf was right out, and I couldn't really think of a much better habitat for a species like the golden eagle. The bearded vulture, the bone breakers, a lot of people have called it. They literally swallow entire bones and use their stomach acids to break that down. And it's been nesting close to Gibraltar up until recently. Lesser kestrel, these birds have been around up until recently in the 19th century. Recently have been declining very steeply, but again, a species that you would expect in similar conditions to what we have at the moment, and they were numerously found. The alpine swift, again, a species which even today you find in Bennett's Cave, which is one of the sister caves to Gorham's and Vanguard, and we find going back thousands of years. Crag martins, this is a species which is very close to our hearts here in Gibraltar, and as you could see from some images back, I said we'd speak about the crag martin. It's important to us because it's something that we'd been, well, at least when I say we, I'm talking about my family, my father Clive and my mother Geraldine. They, in the 70s, started working with crag martins in Gorham's and Vanguard. And, you know, when you're seeing so many hundreds of these birds flying around you, making use of Gorham's and Vanguard caves, and when you start excavations, you start digging up remains and you identify the bones of a 40,000-year-old crag martin, you realize not much has changed in those 40,000 years. The same bird is here making use of the same site as it was so many years ago. Black redstarts, a common bird during the winter. Okay, so the next bit I'd like to talk about is, again on the rock, but the olive marquis. And just as a quick example, the pied flycatcher, it's one of the migrants that uses the area, and they would have been on the coastal shelf. They would have been using this type of habitat openly, and again, we have remains of them from the caves. Sticking to it, the rock, we're talking the rocky shoreline. Now, rocky shoreline, obviously it's what we have now, but when the coastal shelf was further out, at least on the southern part, we definitely know from the bathymetry that it gets rather steep, and we would have had a rocky shoreline as opposed to a sandy beach, which you would have had on the eastern side. And species that would have been using that, again, are species which, well, gladly with the European shag, seem to be increasing in the population size on the rock. I mean, Gorham's and Vanguard are extremely protected. They're part of the Gibraltar Nature Reserve, and I think we can safely say that we've seen a steady increase. They're doing quite well. Lately, the population seems to be doing quite well, but, well, we find the remains going back many, many years. Northern gannet, the guillemot, species which you need to go further north. Sometimes you see in the area during the winter. And puffins. I mean, not a lot of people realize that we do have puffins in Gibraltar. We just don't have them coming onto the rock. But if you go just off on a boat off the rock, you will, at certain times of the year, see puffins, and this is something that's a species that has obviously been using the Rock of Gibraltar for many, many years. Now I wanted to mention the pinnacles and outcrops, because it's one of the things that was identified by our team years ago. Part of our team has been surveying a lot underwater, trying to understand the landscape as it used to be, and these pinnacles would have been important, not so much for the birds, but definitely, I mean, if you go to Africa, these pinnacles would have been used by lions and so on. And I think Neanderthals, it's an important thing to note that these people could have used that maybe as a lookout, maybe to see where different animals are and so on. But it's good to mention that they're there. And then the coastal shelf that we've been talking about, as marked there. We spoke about the seasonal lakes, and it's important because, as I was explaining before, the main thing that you need to survive is water. I think it's definitely more important than food. I think food would be second to water. You can starve for a few days, but I think you dehydrate really rather quickly. So water source, extremely important. Gibraltar at the moment doesn't have a natural water source. There's no rivers or anything, but these lakes would have been important, not just for drinking water for these people, but for the birds. And as you can imagine, a lot of species would have been using these lakes. And in turn, these Neanderthals would have been using these species whenever they had the opportunity to catch them. So things like the glossy ibis, mallard ducks, amongst many other ducks that you would find, such as the tufted duck, and so on. All right, the coastal shelf yet again, but this time we're going to talk about the dunes. And there would have been a lot of rolling dunes. For those of you who know the Doñana National Park, it's one of the best examples that I know of where you can see how fluid and how active dunes are and how much vegetation can actually live on these dunes. We would have had a lot of that. They're not always free of vegetation like a lot of people think. These things are moving extremely quickly. And, you know, you can have a lot of trees. The example here is the stone pine living in these dune habitats. What happens with that? Well, you get a lot of very different species using that. Things like the stone curlew, crested larks, which you still find in the area, and all the way to things like the black-eared wheatears, which they're trans-Saharan migrants, and they would have used, you know, wooded areas and so on. Okay, sticking obviously with the coastal shelf, we're now going to talk about the marsh and dune interface. Now, it's an important area. It's actually a habitat I love working in, and you find animals such as this. This is the cinereous vulture. It used to be called the black vulture, and they love nesting on trees in nice open areas where they can scavenge. I mean, this is a very big vulture, very big scavenger. And again, we find these remains going back, you know, 120,000 years here in Gorham's Cave. But other species that would have been using that kind of open habitat, things like the goshawk, the tawny owl, which again, you do find in Gibraltar on occasions. Even species like the hawfinch, seed-eating birds, they would have exploited the habitat, the crops provided by the pines and other trees. Woodpeckers, they would have been using this particular interface. Partridges, I mean, you can imagine that as being a pretty good food source for Neanderthals. I mentioned the vulture before, and black kites at certain times of the year, and the azure-winged magpie. The common magpie, roller, a beautiful migrant bird, insect eater, that comes in from tropical Africa in the summer. We still find it in the area today, and these, again, were other examples of birds that we would have been finding within this habitat on the coastal shelf. The hoopoe, which does use the Rock of Gibraltar to this day, and the great bustard, as we explained before. Okay, so the coastal shelf once again, and this time we're going to talk about the marshland, extremely important for birds. So here we're talking about a different kind of bird, things such as the black-winged stilt waders, the redshank, and I mean, I'm giving you some examples. I mean, there's a lot of equivalents on other species. I can't go through all of them, but things like the purple heron, a beautiful bird that again you find in the area but would have been living and making use of Gibraltar at one point. White stork, an extremely common bird at the moment but well known to be using marshland. Short-eared owls, white-tailed eagles. Now, you don't find the white-tailed eagle in the area at the moment, but obviously it was here at one point, a beautiful eagle. And we do have the remains of the white-tailed eagle in Gorham's and Vanguard Cave. and the sandy beaches. Now, I'm only going to put one example here, but it's the ring plover, you know, a small little bird that would have been using the beaches, running up and down, like there are many other species, you know, things like the oyster catchers and so on. But it gives you an idea of the huge variety of species that we have been finding in these caves. And yeah, the sea. The sea was always a rich source of food, from cetaceans to fish and birds. We know that Neanderthals consumed these, but you know, what we can't say from the evidence that we have at the moment is, you know, Neanderthals went out and caught tuna or dolphins out on the sea. What we do know is that they were processing these remains. We have evidence and cut marks on the bones of different species of seal, dolphin, and tuna as examples. Cut marks on the bones, and these remains are found within the cave. We can't go as far as saying that they've caught them, but they were definitely eating them. You can see there the example of where the beach level would have been, where the sea would have been. And obviously in the sea, at different points, at different cold moments and warm moments, you would have even had things like this amazing King Ida. I had to go to 70 degrees north in the high Arctic to be able to take this image of the King Ida. Even the Stellar's Ida, for those bird nuts out there that you can see out of focus in the background, extremely cold species from the Arctic areas, but again we have the evidence that these birds were here. So it's what I was trying to explain before. What we consider the Arctic now would have been completely inhospitable even for species like this. There was nothing there, it was pure ice. Everything was compressed down, so even these Arctic species were cohabiting at certain times. Species that you still find today in large numbers, the Cory's shearwater, as any other example, and things such as the kittiwake are also evident. So in summary, what do we know? The Gibraltar Pleistocene caves have offered a huge opportunity for understanding the distribution of birds at the time in a Mediterranean context. These caves offer the richest Pleistocene avifauna resource in the world. The potential guarantees further work for decades, as I was explaining before. It's not only the material that we're extracting now, how much work we've got going on at the moment, how much further work there is to do, but also that we're leaving such large amounts of deposit within the cave unexcavated for future generations, for new technologies to be able to be used, and so on. And the avifauna reveals a mainly Mediterranean avifauna representing a rich mix of habitats and habitat mosaics. The presence of these Arctic species reflects conditions elsewhere rather than the presence of tundra within our area at any stage, and I think that's an important one. And with that, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart, very much for that very interesting talk. There's one question that's come in via the YouTube. Mary Thornton and Sheila Chisel have asked, does back guano offer any paleo evidence for climatic or other reconstruction? Because Tyson Holmes is going to be looking at that later on, we'll defer that question until then. But if there are any other questions from the floor, Clive is going to field them. Do we have any questions? Clive, I'll ask a question. The rich material that we have, the avifaunal material, is most of it in Gibraltar, or is there a relatively large amount or other amount elsewhere?
It was, the Gorham's material was all in Gibraltar, except what Eastham looked at from Vector's material. The Devil's Tower material from Garrod is in the Natural History Museum in London. I'm pleased that in the last 2 years I have a PhD student working with me on her PhD on birds at John Moores in Liverpool, and we managed with her to contact Anne Eastham, who had all the Gibraltar material in her own private collection, and we can discuss how that was acquired or not. But I'm very pleased to say that we've got it back in the last year. So all the Eastham avifauna is now in the Gibraltar National Museum. So the only avifauna material that is not in Gibraltar, from Gibraltar, is the avifauna from Devil's Tower Rock Shelter, which is extremely interesting actually, and which is in the Natural History Museum in London.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any further questions? Comments? No? Okay, thank you very much, Stuart, and thank you very much, Clive, for answering that question. Thank you. We'll break for lunch and then be back at, let me see,